There are times when a person's strongest skill is not knowledge, but presentation. A steady voice, a confident rhythm, a look that suggests familiarity. We tend to assume that expertise reveals itself through substance, and often it does. Yet in certain settings, the appearance of certainty can do much of the work, allowing claims to pass through rooms unchallenged, collecting respect along the way. Most people do not demand proof in casual moments. They accept the fluent sentence, the well-timed reference, the posture of someone who seems to belong, and slowly, what began as an impression becomes a reputation. The question remains, how many things we believe because they sound correct, and what we trade away when performance is treated as proof.
His name was David Clark, and he had a rather unusual obsession. For years, David had been captivated by Chinese culture, its philosophy, art, and history. But his fascination wasn't simply academic, it went far deeper. He didn't just want to know about Chinese culture, he wanted to live it, to breathe it. And so, naturally, he decided that he would speak Mandarin. But there was just one problem. He never actually learned Mandarin. Instead, David created his own version of Chinese, what he called cultural Mandarin. This hybrid tongue was composed of a series of mostly authentic-sounding phrases strung together with an odd mix of made-up sounds and real words he'd picked up from documentaries and books. The key was tone and rhythm. To the untrained ear, it sounded flawless. No one ever questioned him, and he didn't need to do anything more than mumble some of his impressive phrases whenever the situation called for it. He spent years in public libraries and online forums, writing entire essays on the spiritual significance of ancient Chinese art and the subtle shifts in Qing dynasty politics, all while carefully avoiding any situation where actual Mandarin might be required. He read about China, he studied it, but language, that was too much work. David's ability to create plausible-sounding gibberish was unmatched. When he spoke, he used his cultural Mandarin to captivate people. He could be at a casual dinner party, and when someone brought up Chinese history or culture, he'd casually slip in a phrase. Something that sounded like, Wo zheng zai tan lun lian tao ren jingdian, which translated, in his mind to, I'm discussing the essence of the classics. His guests would nod solemnly, seemingly impressed, unsure of what he had said but accepting it as deep. It wasn't until one fateful evening, when he attended a local fundraiser, that the wheels of his carefully constructed empire began to wobble. The event was a mix of Chinese expatriates and their American allies, gathered to raise money for an arts initiative. David was there to impress. He had perfected the art of dropping Chinese-sounding words into conversation like a seasoned diplomat. He introduced himself to a group of attendees and, after a brief chat about Confucian philosophy, slipped in one of his favorite phrases, Shi Jia Zhi Ho Vi Zhi Zhi Shi Jin Lu, which of course meant absolutely nothing. There was a beat of silence, then a soft laugh. It wasn't rude, just curious. He glanced around, but no one was questioning him outright. No one except for one person, a woman named May, who was visiting from Beijing. She had moved to the U.S. just a year ago, but she had impeccable Mandarin. She leaned forward. That's an interesting phrase, she said, smiling politely. But I think you might have gotten the tones mixed up. What exactly are you trying to say? David blinked, momentarily thrown off. May was one of the few people who might actually understand his secret. He did his best to quickly recover, running through his mental library of excuses. Oh, well, you see, he said, his voice smooth. I was actually referring to an ancient, pre-Qin dialect. It's very obscure, used by scholars in the more remote parts of China. Not much is known about it. He paused for dramatic effect. It's quite difficult to master. I only use it when discussing the most complex ideas. May raised an eyebrow. Really? That's interesting. You're sure it's pre-Qin? Because I'm fairly certain what you just said doesn't exist anywhere, even in ancient texts. It sounded more like, but David, master of the diversion, interjected before she could finish her sentence. Ah yes, the essence of language changes with each dynasty, doesn't it? And that's what I've always loved about China. Its constant evolution. He gestured grandly, steering the conversation toward the real topic at hand, art and history. Speaking of which, have you seen the Terracotta Army? Absolutely fascinating. May blinked, momentarily thrown off by his sudden change of direction. But before she could respond, the conversation was swarmed by other guests, eager to hear David's thoughts on Chinese calligraphy. The crisis had been averted. A few weeks later, David's reputation continued to grow. He was invited to give a talk at a local university on the intersection of traditional Chinese aesthetics and contemporary design. He was now a regular feature at local cultural events. In his talks, he delivered his cultural Mandarin with confidence, even in front of scholars who should have known better. However, things began to go sideways when he was invited to appear on a popular cultural talk show. The show, which had over 500,000 viewers, featured a segment on cross-cultural dynamics between China and the U.S. David was once again presented as an expert, a person whose extensive knowledge of Chinese art, history, and, yes, language made him a cultural ambassador of sorts. On the air, he delivered another long string of his infamous cultural Mandarin, extolling the virtues of the ancient philosophy of harmony. The host, a renowned journalist with some knowledge of China, smiled and nodded, looking to David for confirmation of his wisdom. But David's string of syllables had an unfamiliar edge to them, one that caught the ear of a guest sitting in the audience, a fluent Mandarin speaker who had lived in Shanghai for over 30 years. With a sly smile, the guest stood up and raised their hand. "Excuse me, David," they called out. "I've been listening to your remarks, and I'm afraid I need to point something out. What you've just said doesn't sound close to Mandarin. In fact, I have no idea what you are saying at all. Why are you doing this?" David paused for a moment. The audience fell silent. Then, with a grin that could only be described as unbelievably smooth, he leaned forward into the microphone. "Let me tell you about a dear friend of mine, my teacher, Old Man Wang. He introduced me to cigarettes, lo mein, illegal fireworks, and 1970s kung fu flicks. It jump-started my love for Chinese culture. He came from a mountainous region in China tucked away from mainstream society, and it's believed that their unique way of speaking goes back several hundreds of years, unchanged." He gave a triumphant smile. "I'll be happy to take questions." The audience was caught in a brief moment of confusion, but many nodded. A few clapped, unsure whether to laugh or applaud. The host, ever the professional, steered the conversation away from the linguistic mishap, guiding David to discuss his expert view on ancient Chinese art, which David handled flawlessly. By the end of the segment, his reputation was, if anything, enhanced. It didn't matter that he was called out. It was all part of the performance. It was all about confidence. After all, who could challenge his passion for Chinese culture? Dozens of Reddit and Twitter posts from users fluent in Chinese called him out for fraud. David responded by setting up a website to debunk his critics. He hired several individuals from Fiverr, all fluent in both Mandarin and English, to defend his character. A man named Chow remarked that David's Mandarin only sounded a bit off because he wasn't a native speaker, and backed up his legitimacy. David Clark never did learn Mandarin. He never enrolled in a class, never picked up a language book. But he continued to attend events, write blogs, give talks, and appear on TV, delighting audiences with his profound insights and exotic linguistic flair. His audiences, whether they were academics or casual observers, saw what they wanted to see. A confident, knowledgeable man with a deep understanding of China's history and philosophy. They never needed to hear actual Mandarin to believe in his expertise. And David, he was content, because, in his world, knowing a language wasn't as important as knowing how to sound like you did.